Okay. Ian, did you want to say a few words about the
I'll open it
FPA?
Yeah, about the FPA Beyond Earth Institute, what you're doing briefly, and then you guys can introduce yourselves, and and I'll mention the report, of course. It's I had difficulty with the link for the report this morning, by the way.
Are we on? Are we live? I'm sorry.
We are live now, I think, a little.
Okay, so I
Are
should
we
just do.
Recording yet, Sam?
We are recording, yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
All right. Well, then, good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Steve Wolfe. I'm the president and co-founder of the Beyond Earth Institute. And I appreciate using this forum with the Foreign Press Association and Ian Williams to help to present a very important paper and set of recommendations that we are putting forward to the U.S. administration. And I look forward to sharing that with you. And if I can, I want to jump right into a set of slides, and then I'm going to overview what I'm going to do here. And just briefly, is I want to tell you a little bit about the Beyond Earth Institute, and then I want to talk about this paper, why it's so important, and why everyone should be paying attention to it. So with that, I'm going to share some slides. We are at Beyond Earth Institute. We're a nonprofit think tank, 501c3, that's focused on looking at space policy as it relates to human expansion into space and beyond Earth.
We have achieved great things.
I think I did not do something right. And I apologize. 1 second. Try that again.
We have made giant leaps. We've gone far beyond what we thought was possible, but we have only just begun. Our future in space is unlimited, and it will benefit all humanity, but it will take hard work, new technologies, advanced financing models, and enabling public policy. The Beyond Earth Institute is creating a policy and legal framework to enable the creation of economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. We will engage all stakeholders on critical policy issues: property rights in space, norms of behavior, conflict resolution protocols, filling the technology gaps, exploring new financing mechanisms, and making space settlement an agreed goal of the U.S. and its allies. Beyond Earth is committed to the true purpose of why we go to space. Join us on this journey.
okay, Steve?
Yes.
You want to? Sure. I am Ian Williams. I'm the president of the Foreign Press Association, and we've had several ventures with Beyond Earth Institute because, well, space is a global issue. We don't have ambassadors from space. In the traditional science fiction we were discussing before it came, people always said, "Take me to your leaders," and they always ended up at the United Nations in New York when the aliens arrived. There's some very good science fiction stories that involve the United Nations with aliens. I'm not quite sure how bother if I were an alien at the moment. I'm not quite sure you get the right answers from them. So this is a very important international issue, and I think it's heartening that even under the present stresses, there is an international space age, and with a motley cosmopolitan crew peddling above our heads, and they're not they're not fighting with each other. So it augurs well for the initiatives that the Beyond Earth Institute is talking about. And it's also a United Nations, was it 67, the Outer Space Treaty? And that was, well, that's the current legal framework, such as there is, for what happens in space. That beyond the 100-mile limit, we have at the moment, nobody can own it. And the type of force you see in Space Force, etc., with people running away with flags and stealing each other's moon bases is literally feasible because there's no property rights. Who says you can put that flag up there? It's not like the good old days where you put the flag and said, this is the King of Spain's. No, it isn't. I've got bigger guns than you. Move. So we're back into the early days of European exploration. But this is extremely important. You know, space it's even playing a role in the war in Ukraine, as we know, with the satellites and the threats and the counter threats. So this is beyond science fiction now. It is a very serious venture. And the Beyond Earth Institute has been trying hard to make opinion makers in Washington and elsewhere in industry and finance take it seriously, and is having a fair degree of success because you can see the private initiatives to put satellites into space. So, Steve, do you want to follow on from there and tell us about the current report where you're recommending to Congress what they should be doing beyond what they already are beyond Earth?
Yes, thank you, Ian. And you make an interesting point that we are in difficult times right now. And I'm reminded that during the Apollo heyday, we were also in a very tumultuous time with regards to civil rights action and dealing with the Vietnam War. So, you can, even in difficult times, achieve high things and have high aspirations. So let me just continue here. I do want to also mention that I am joined with two distinguished individuals that co-wrote this paper, and I will be introducing them, Courtney Stadd and Robert Brumley, after I give this short briefing. So again, our mission of the Beyond Earth Institute is to establish and sustain a policy and legal framework that enables economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. We're very straightforward on that topic. And we're doing this because we recognize of this emerging in-space ecosystem that is about to that is growing and is about to extend to the moon and beyond. In this simple chart, or I should say not so simple chart, they're represented over 400 companies that have intention of going to the moon and engaging in space commerce in different ways, whether there has to do with propellant depots, lunar ground transportation, cislunar transportation, water and food supply manufacturing in space. It is in the next 20 to 30 years, we are going to see extraordinary lengths. And this is where we see the beginnings of human expansion into space and the potential for human migration ultimately. These are a series of focus areas that our organization is looking into, declarations. We're interested in science and technology development. We're interested in the financing mechanisms, how to establish the rules of laws and norms of behavior. And actually that is largely where our report today is focused. We are very active in terms of having programs, webinars, issuing papers. We recently came off of our inaugural Beyond Earth Symposium on October 13th. It included on the far left here is Kathy Leaders, who is the NASA head of space operations. She heads the moon project for NASA and other dignitaries. And let me just move on here. I want to get right into our paper, but I encourage you really to go to our website at beyondearth.org, look up all the things that we're doing. But today we're focusing on a release of a paper. It's called Emerging Space Industrial Ecosystem Leading to Eventual Beyond Earth Migration, how the US government can avoid being left behind. It was in September that Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the chair of the National Space Council, specifically said that we know that if we are to partner, if we are to invest in the commercial space sector, we need clarity and consistency in order to move forward. And we know that we must, that we need new rules that allow flexibility to incorporate and innovate that is occurring in real time. And that's really what our report is trying to address. We need these rules of the road. You know, we feel that we had missed an opportunity with the Artemis program. Those of you should be aware that the United States plans to return 3 astronauts to the surface of the moon and do exploration, human exploration of the surface of the planet. We're concerned that we're organizing ourselves for yet another flags and footprint mission to the moon. And the opportunity here that was missed is in putting this mission into a much broader context of saying that we are a nation, we are a world that is on the brink of becoming, of enabling space migration. In particular, we are trying to change the conversation around space and space migration. And we are offering a set of new talking points for the future, if you will, that very much relate to this paper. So we want to, folks need to be thinking about space migration as offering possibilities that will be immeasurable, and they will not only help benefit those people that choose to travel to space, but those who remain on Earth. We need to shift from being a government-led aspirational programs to more practical, intangible, and equitable projects that are driven by the private sector. Government aspirational space projects should not compete with the private sector for resources, for capital, human capital, ideas, regulatory regimes, and so forth. The taxpayers' dollars should be used to stimulate and support the private commercial space activities through public-private partnerships and other measures. Beyond Earth, let's see here. Let's see, okay. And international and national rules of law governing human rights and employee safety and benefits protections must apply equally in space. So this idea that we may have these sort of sweatshops in space, that's not going to occur. All of the laws that govern us are going to expand and extend out into space. And as Robert Brumley, who will introduce you today, will argue that we need to stop thinking about using the term space. Doing things in space is just simply an extension of everything that we already do here down on Earth. Beyond basic norms of human rights and security, we want to make sure that human settlements will be allowed to self-govern as long as they're balancing development and environmental impact, similar to the Antarctica Convention. Commercial property rights and liability clarification beyond current international laws must be established before major expansion into space can occur. Sorry, Ian, we don't want to have the Wild West in space. We want to really have clear direction on the use of the resources in outer space. It's important for investors of all kinds. A similar legal regime must be determined to oversee intellectual property disputes and potential criminal behavior. We want to know what we're getting into. We want to know that we're entering a regime, an area where things are consistent and reliable. So the Beyond Earth migration will be available to all who wish to go and are able to participate. While some may pay to live in space habitats, the vast majority will build career-based lives in space for themselves and their families. So these are the talking points that I encourage you all to really begin to embrace. Now, what about this? What about the paper, and what are we proposing? We are asking the president, through the efforts of the Vice President Harris and the National Space Council, to establish a Beyond Earth working group as an interagency body directed to promote, facilitate, and publicly promulgate, not study, the policies, incentives, investments, laws, regulations, and essential to expedite the migration of humankind beyond Earth. So what is the purpose and the scope? The main purpose and scope of this entity, we want to have a clear mandate to formulate specific measurable objectives and a course of action rather than aspirational goal. We don't want to just set up goals. We want to be very specific. And these will have a high probability of near-term adoption and implementation in the present administration. We want to commit to a broad-based effort, not incremental or narrow initiatives. So we need to be thinking very big, but acting very clearly. We want to involve the entire cabinet, and we want the cabinet. We want all. This is all of government approach to this, and the members of this working group need to have the authority to make decisions and speak for their departments. So setting up this structure is very important as we engage in the breadth of the policy areas that this working group will cover. First, we are looking at international, both at the State Department and NASA, review all norms and agreements and jurisdictional boundaries, make sure all of these things are aligned properly. We want the defense and national security involved, DoD, DHS, National Security Council, because we're concerned to deal with concerns relating to near Earth, cislunar, translunar, and beyond issues. We are looking at regulatory issues, survey the applicability regimes, streamline licensing, such as launch and spectrum licensing. These are a little wonky, and I apologize for that, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to reorient the way the government looks at space and addresses space. It needs to be a top line, a top priority issue for the government, because it is so critical to the future of not only the United States, but the world. Finance, investment, survey investment rules, tax incentives, competitive flexibility, and insurance. So much we could do in this area. Government procurement through the GSA and the Office of Management and Budget. We want to create incentives and as well as deal with impediments. And we want to deal with conflict resolution through the State Department and the Justice Department. We're looking at legal forms, courts of origin, jurisdiction. There's so much to go on here in terms of being able to mitigate conflict issues, as well as dispute resolution. And finally, the rules of the road, commerce, treasury, labor, justice, rules of the road for our economic expansion into new territories beyond Earth. There's so much here that we have not even begun as a country or as a nation or as an international community to really wrap our arms around the full breadth of the issues that need to be addressed if we are to commit ourselves to and recognizing that we are on a path to move beyond Earth and one day establish new branches of civilization beyond Earth. And finally, we're putting forth a second priority in the paper. We're suggesting that to fast track space, to fast track trade promotion authority, authority for space commerce. So there is something already called within the USTR called Fast Track Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, right? What we want to do is work with our international partners, the European Union, the UK, Japan, for the purposes of establishing under this category, a space trade agreement. And this would be a rules of the road for trade and investment in off-planet commerce. So what are some of the aspects of this space trade agreement? It would include all interested current and future spacefaring nations. It would address all economic jurisdictional enforcement issues today, providing the needed certainty for popular investment and business expansion for tomorrow. It will effectively bring all off-planet business activities into an international trading system. And finally, we will migrate future disputes among nations competing for scarce space resources through the WTO in lieu of a conflict. This is important. How will we deal with international conflict? We need a regime and a mechanism for that. And this is something that the administration can do right now. So with that, I want to turn over for comment to the authors of this paper, Courtney Stadd and Robert Brumley. Now, and let me stop sharing here. So Courtney, just by way of introduction, Courtney is the founder and president of Capital Alliance. He has 40-year career in a mix of senior government leadership and corporate executive jobs. He spent most of his career encouraging and removing policy regulatory barriers to emerging competitive American commercial space marketplace. He's worked as leading roles in Department of Commerce, the U.S. Department of Transportation, the White House, the National Space Council, and he has worked directly for several NASA administrators as advisors. And then secondly, Robert Brumley, who is the CEO of LaserLight, and he is a senior manager and director of Marble Arc Partners. He is the former senior executive of Deutsche Telekom and Bell Atlantic International. He was appointed by President Ronald Reagan as chief legal officer of the Department of Commerce and senior policy advisor to the Secretary of Commerce. He was on Ronald Reagan's policy working group. He was a chair of the policy working group that privatized commercial space transportation. So what I'm getting at, we have two extremely experienced, prominent individuals who have helped to create the pathways towards commercial space helped to shape it over the last 3 to 4 decades, quite literally. So with that, Courtney, if you'll make a statement, then Bob, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Ian, you can hear me okay?
Oh, yes, yes.
Thank you. So for the younger members of the FPA, let me take them back just for about a second to the 80s and then focus on the future. But I do want to quickly add that that Bob and I live in a very pragmatic world, and the reason we affiliated ourselves with the Beyond Earth think tank is under Steve's leadership that's focused on the block and tackle policy regulatory issues. We care about business. We live in a P&L, profit and loss world. And so these issues are really very key to some of the ventures that Bob and I are involved with. So for the younger members, let me take them back for a brief moment to the 80s when I was working for Bob Brumley at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and he was my boss. He and the team really fought very, very hard to take what I'll call the metaphorical foot of the government off the neck of the nascent commercial launch sector, believing that a robust launch market would be generated. Believe me, there were many opponents, there were many people who had a vested interest in the status quo at the time. But sure enough, after NASA was prohibited from launching commercial satellites, a multi-billion-dollar market was triggered, and decades later, we now take for granted that the taxpayer is benefiting from government as customer, working with a range of innovative companies such as SpaceX, of course, and Rocket Lab, among many others. And now here we are in 2022, and we see the rapid emergence of a space ecosystem. Steve showed you earlier the chart with about 400, just a snapshot of the rapidly growing ecosystem, laying the foundation for the seemingly audacious goal of an off-planet migration into the high frontier, and this time on a permanent basis. Now, we applaud the White House and the bipartisan congressional support. How often do you hear bipartisan and Congress in the same sentence? For the Artemis program and the ongoing efforts by the Space Council to study various aspects of in-space manufacturing services, as well as the cislunar economy. But, capital BUT, our paper outlines specific recommendations regarding how the administration can greatly expand its interagency efforts and execute, not just study, but execute on the various initiatives that Steve alluded to ensure that the government, again, is a facilitator and not an impediment to this exciting future in space. And finally, as you hear from my colleague Bob, when you remove space as the qualifier, it's sort of amazing how many of the issues lend themselves to time-tested terrestrial practice. So with that said, I'll turn it over to you, Bob.
Thanks, Courtney. We continue to do these programs together. We're sort of the Ben and Jerry's of the space policy world. I won't take them back to the 80s. I enjoyed the 80s. I thought it was great. But the real point of what the Reagan administration did, and I think it's relative today, is we had the catalyst driving new public policy with the loss of Challenger. And people somewhat forget that. It's not forgotten to me that I was over in the White House when at the EPC, at the Economic Policy Council, the day that happened, and it was fundamentally an all hands on deck program. It showed the consequences of basically having a single capability, what we call a single point of failure, relative to everything that we would be trying to do in space then. In the future, we had plans for a space station at the time, and the idea of losing transportation and being unable to deploy the space station, it then led to State Department concerns about our position, our stature in space, not in space, but in our international relations, but also the Department of Defense concerned about our ability to basically defend the nation, space being a new frontier, a high ground, if you will. So there was a public policy group that was brought together called the Commercial Space Working Group. It was chaired by the Secretary of Commerce, and it was vice chaired by NASA. And it involved every department and agency, because the loss of Challenger was viewed as a national crisis. It wasn't viewed as a space program problem. And that meant it brought everyone in from the State Department all the way down to the Labor Department to HHS and HUD, et cetera. So that working group formed a series of proposals, one of which Courtney has mentioned, which was the headline proposal, and that is to basically take NASA out of what would be delivery of commercial space launches and have the private sector step into that role. It did take 34 years for that to actually implement, but it is implemented, and as a result, as Courtney pointed out, certainly since 2013, you've seen the price per pound of space go down. And if these commercial launchers achieve their goal, it'll get down to numbers that are unheard of or even thought of, and it'll open up access to space on an accelerated basis. That gets me to this point, last point that Courtney made. My cabinet secretary was a gentleman by the name of Mac Baldridge. And Mac was the one who coined the phrase, space is a modifier of a business sector. All business sectors generally are the same. They should be run by the same rules. They should be run by the same standards. They should be predictable. There should be certainty. So the private sector, the Chamber of Commerce, NAM, the Business Roundtable, all know where their constituencies operate. When you put space in front of it, you end up saying, oh, well, that's different. That's special. And his punchline was always, after Challenger, space shouldn't be and isn't special anymore. It should be a new business sector, but it shouldn't be one that you have to have all sorts of special credentials to be able to compete in. We see that happening on an accelerated basis now. So 30 some years later, it's time for another public policy round similar to the one we did in the Reagan administration, where everything's on the table. Every cabinet official has an opportunity to participate. It's all inclusive, including the Congress, and then run this into what would be potential either executive orders or legislation. Lastly, the trade agreement is stating the obvious. There's not one contract for service delivery right now of hardware and software off this planet that is not governed by a contract that was executed and enforceable on this planet. Consequently, you don't create new legal regimes for space. You extend our existing legal regimes, our trade policies, the rules of the road, if you will, and we just extend them up into this new sector and take space off the modifier and make it just what would be as it should be, as ubiquitous as it is here on Earth. Back to you, Steve.
No, thank you, Bob. I think I want to just turn it back over to our host, Ian.
Well, you know,
Questions?
there's lots of interesting stuff, and especially for those of us old enough to remember the history. And one of the driving forces for the space race in the beginning was international rivalry. And, you know, fortunately or unfortunately, the Russians seem to be out the case mostly now. So to what extent can rivalry with China, which seems to be filling the gap, be the motivating factor for concentrating Congress's mind on the issue? Because this was very much the case with Ronald Reagan. I mean, there was with the high frontiers policy of the time, it was very much an attempt to leverage fears of defense to get people into space, because only the Pentagon could get calls on the budget immediately. So is that still the case, that we can leverage the international rivalries and whisper discreetly into xenophobic thoughts into Congress's ear about foreign threats to get more attention to space?
Oh yeah, it's being done now. The chip crisis, and we have a CHIPS Act because of the chips crisis for semiconductor chips. One of the justifications for domestic production of semiconductor chips is, in fact, it goes into our space industry. It goes into, whether it be commercial like Starlink, or it goes into what would be advanced platforms that would be either going up tomorrow or in the future. And because the Chinese were the primary justification of the CHIPS Act, then essentially, as we used to say, if you're going to get action out of the Congress, you need a boogeyman. And whoever the boogeyman might be at the moment, you need to make the boogeyman relevant to what you're trying to get done. So if we don't do it, you've heard this before, Ian, the Chinese will do it first. And so we can't let that happen. So we have to do it first. And then you got to be more specific, because the risk is, if we don't do it, who's we? DOD or Amazon or SpaceX? What we're saying is, you can now say today, the Chinese are going to do it if we don't do it. And we is more powerful than China because it's American industry. It is not a nationalization, it's the industrialization of a national effort. And that's bigger than the Congress. That is way bigger than NASA, and it'll have more effect on China.
And a subset of that, Ian, if I may, is a wrinkle that nobody could have anticipated when they drafted the Outer Space Treaty. We have a proliferation of these commercial assets, imaging, communications, et cetera, government more and more dependent on them, not just civilian, but national security, of course, and they're being threatened. In fact, Putin's head of space has overtly threatened. And we know that there are demonstrations and tests being undertaken by both China and Russia. So if a commercial asset is in fact threatened and put out of action, what is the obligation of the government, right? I mean, that's a new set of issues today that we hadn't confronted earlier. But I don't want to put words in Bob's mouth, but I imagine if he was still general counsel of commerce and was brought to his inbox, the fact commercial asset was under threat, I don't think, Bob, you'd have to invent new policies and laws to deal with that in terms of where the obligations are.
Do you think the international conventions on piracy can be stretched into outer space? I'd remind you that one of the conventions, that the conventions allow for hanging for convicted pirates.
Well, that's actually my parent company's name is Mark Church, where they used to hang pirates in the UK. So that is a nice segue. But I think if you take out, it's funny. If you look at the fact of space, and then you look at, for example, the deep ocean, it's interesting that people don't really think there should be new laws relative to exploring the deep oceans, but there needs to be some laws relative to space. I think there's a vast majority of our legal regimes, including maybe the agreements on piracy, that could in fact be applicable. And you don't have to say anything more. In fact, I was talking to a member of His Majesty's government, Her Majesty's government, just a few months ago, and he wanted to understand the role critical infrastructure in the UK played to space. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, space is different, so it doesn't apply to space, hardware, software, or services. So it's critical infrastructure. It's telecommunications. Consequently, telecommunications happens to operate physically in space. So what would you need to do to make it applicable to critical infrastructure? He said, well, we'd have to pass a law. You'd have to pass a law that says critical infrastructure includes space. Why can't you just state that as a matter of fact? And he went, no, we'd have to pass a law. So it's if it's not mentioned, it doesn't apply. So piracy in space is not mentioned, therefore it doesn't apply. When in fact, logically, except for hanging, logically it does apply. And there's a variety of laws and regulations that apply if you take out the modifier of space.
Hanging is difficult in a zero gravity environment, but that's just a macabre side. No, the issue, one of the issues is territoriality, is that, in fact, since we mentioned the science, Robert Heinlein in his pioneering science fiction, which was advocating privatization of space, raised the question, who owns it? And the traditional definition was, you took it, you had your national boundaries, which went at that time, I think it was 3, went to 12 miles offshore, and you extrapolated outwards. And then the Outer Space Treaty put the 100-mile limit on it, because otherwise we'd be claiming galaxies and the moon on the basis of where they were. But they don't stay in the same place, so it's difficult. And we haven't really got round to working out when you have a river boundary and it's the Talve, the river course up the middle, if that wanders, where is the boundary? In the age of geosynchronous satellites and tracking, geo-tracking.
Your reference to maritime law is a good example. There was a time when, and maybe it still is true, that any vessel anywhere that was flagged that carried the jack was a UK vessel. It was England. Didn't matter where it floated, it was England.
Be careful, the Scots will be on your case.
Yeah, but anyway, but the point is that applies to space now. The United States, through the Department of Transportation and Courtney's work, and right now they would be providing a spacecraft license for launches. Well, that's governed by that license, basically makes that spacecraft American. And therefore, all the baggage and the good stuff that goes with being an American licensed craft, if you will, goes with it. So if it goes up, all of our laws and regulations go with it. Consequently, you don't really need anything other than the fact that you've got a licensing regime that then applies it. There are some interesting ideas that you can go to space and then you can do anything you want up there because there's no rules. To get you there, you have to have a spacecraft license. And if you're a payload on the spacecraft license, it has to be declared who you are. Now, ultimately be smarter people, but this working group could deal with it. Data protection rights. You want to put a data center up on the moon or someplace, and you want to essentially put all sorts of, let's say, gambling information or anything like that, and think that no one can get access to it. That data center is licensed. It's down here. It's licensed up there. Now, the data in that facility is governed by the data rules and regulations down here. So again, remove space from it and all the rules that apply should apply. But it needs, like the gentleman in the UK, maybe do I have to pass a law to state the obvious? Or I can do it with an executive order? Or maybe I do pass an omnibus bill that makes it clear that all American rules and regulations that apply to fill in the blank shall apply by way of a launch license or certification, or like in maritime, a vessel license to that entity, no matter where it is.
Just to add to that, Ian, if American company decides to launch, let's say from one of the proposed UK spaceports, that they would still have to get a license. Now they would do it in coordination with the UK Space Agency, the appropriate licensing authority. But to Bob's point, that license does follow the tail, in this case, American rocket, wherever it goes. And if you happen to have an American payload going on a foreign rocket, again, to Bob's point, that has a US government license attached to it, in that case, from the Federal Communications Commission as well, or from the Department of Commerce, vis-a-vis a commercial imaging license as well, just to add to that.
Well, this is the balance between initiative and regulation comes with the issue of space junk. I mean, extraterrestrial flotsam and jetsam might make it impossible for your immigrant ships to leave the Earth if they keep crashing into debris from people launching ad hoc mini satellites. And it's one of the issues now. Of course, you know, the commercial satellites the Russians are complaining about because they're not getting dibs on them. How can you regulate that? Can you tell Elon Musk, look, you know, you've really gone too far. Our telescopes can't see the skies because you've got so many things buzzing around. It's getting difficult to launch because we'll hit them. Where do you draw the line on saying we must regulate?
That's an easy one, simply because Elon or anyone else in the space business will pay attention to costs. And essentially the cost comes into two categories. One is you make what would be the risk fit based on insurance that's required to deploy those systems. So whatever the insurable risk is, it can't be borne firstly by the taxpayer. It has to be borne firstly by the commercial operator. And if the commercial operator is putting up 10,000 satellites with the potential of essentially cratering or bashing into another 2,500, the insurance companies are really good about running tables on what that cost would be and how many billions of dollars that would be, and then what the premiums would be. Where the government, the US government, has a balance. Do we want to be a third-party insurer to encourage, facilitate, and promote what would be the private sector going into what would be, in this case, low Earth orbit? Now you've got cost-benefit analysis, and maybe the government ought to get out of the third-party insurance business, except relative to cost for deorbiting or cleanup, but that still should be borne by whoever the primary owner operator, because they're getting the revenue, the Treasury is getting the tax revenue, but somebody's got to clean it up. And if you slap on insurance on the front end, I think you're going to have, it'll create, from the finance standpoint, another consideration relative to financing large constellations.
Yeah.
And then what you would do when, in fact, you have a problem with them.
That's a big driver on the insurance side. Bob,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to talk over
That's right.
the comment. You also have another variable, and this is not to diminish the fact that orbital debris is a big problem. It is ironic to hear the Russians complain, since they've contributed hugely to the problem, as have the Chinese with their anti-satellite efforts, and created all sorts of debris issues. But we all have.
Maybe you can explain to people that they actually took shots at satellites in space.
Yes, indeed.
Thousands of items of space debris.
So I just want to add, Ian, that to Bob's point, first of all, that's a huge driver on the insurance side. The other is technology. Companies are not sitting idly by with this debris issue. They're coming up with very innovative ways to re-enter their vehicles as benignly as possible. I must also add that the entrepreneurial genius, now that it's been unleashed, we are beginning to see the beginnings of rethinking the idea of taking this satellite fully assembled, partially out of the gravity well into orbit, versus taking elements and assembling them in orbit through various techniques, not the least of which is this advances in additive manufacturing in space. So there really is almost the beginnings of a paradigm shift in assembly in orbit that will also, in my judgment, help inhibit a lot of the debris issues that we're dealing with. So there's an interesting convergence of various variables that I think will make the issue manageable in the years to come. Meanwhile, we'll be dealing with some major problems, not the least of which the astronomers dealing with, obstruction by some of the constellations. But we'll work through that.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Ian, I think that what this working group that we're proposing could do, certainly there are issues that are immediate concern, right? Orbital debris has to be dealt with, and I think in varying degrees, depending how you look at it, it is being addressed within internationally, and certainly this working group can be involved in those discussions and enhancing them in relative ways. But then it's looking beyond that, like it's really important to look on the horizon of these policy implications without, and it's the challenge, without dictating prescriptions, without picking winners and losers, right? Because I know Bob would say we'd never want to do that. So how are we, so there's so much potential here for us to take a more long lead approach to our space policy, commercial space policy thinking that could come through a deliberative body of this nature that has the appropriate authority as we've been stressing.
But it's not just, I mean, what you're trying to do is to get a focus for the United States government to take these issues seriously. But then the second stage, once we're in that orbit, is to take it into international agreement, because it's all very well you saying it's US law, but if the Chinese say that satellite's flying over our airspace, therefore it's in our territory, therefore we can take action if we don't like what it's doing.
Yeah, that's true. One of the things that was brought up at our space symposium on October 13th did not get a lot of attention. One of our speakers spoke to something called the Washington Compact, and the three of us are all signatories of that compact. And it's an effort by the Hague Institute for Global Justice. They're going to get into more details, have a more formal rollout in a couple of months. So just a heads up to your membership. So I don't want to steal any of their thunder, but suffice it to say that they have come up with an alternative, if you will, or augmentation to the Artemis Accords, which is exclusively government in terms of establishing some norms associated with government managed space. This is for the non-government, the commercial sector, to begin to provide that frame that Bob and us we've been alluding to begin to have the industry around the world begin to work together cooperatively on these various norms, because it's essential to our balance sheet. We simply can't wait for government to catch up. All of the subtitle of our paper. So there are initiatives, Ian, that are being taken by industry as a whole. Bob, it looked like you were going to say something. Sorry.
Yeah, it is not an overly simplistic approach to this to talk about international agreements. We look back in some of our darker history of expanding nations through imperialism and colonialism, that it was basically who got there first or who had the largest battleships or whatever, and they could claim the property. In the 21st century, the versions of that, ironically, are really, I don't think they have as much analogy as we sometimes draw on. We have a regulated economy. We have a regulated global economy, and it's incentivized for bad actors to be called out in that economy and be brought to justice, if you will, at the WTO. Use China as an example. China hates being pulled in front of the World Trade Organization for either dumping or countervailing duties or for violating intellectual property, because they can't do whether it's an empty chair or whether they actually show up, which they do show up, they can't stand to be sanctioned by an international organization. They, by the way, also take us to the WTO for things that the United States does. So the WTO is as close to, because it's trade and it's business, and is close to sort of the place you can actually sharp elbow each other. Then you look at what a trade agreement would do. It would take off the table, which is right now about 50% of almost all webinars on space have to do with law. Who owns the moon? What are we going to do about the Outer Space Treaty? It takes that off the table because we have existing norms. We have the international trading system. It has worked pretty well in conflict resolution. Courtney's example of assembling satellites in space versus building them on the Earth and launching them is nothing different than what is called the major transformation rule of certain products that are brought together, like automotive products that were brought together in low-cost assemblage locations like Mexico, and no offense, Canada, and they were shipped over into our border at basically dumped prices. So automobile parts that come from all over the world, assembled across your border, dumped in your market, satellite products that are assembled from all over the world up in space orbit and are dumped in the market. Same thing. The only difference is space is special. I'm just telling you, it's not special. The laws can apply equally to it. If there's an acknowledgement, that means that most of what I would expect the near history is going to be are some really sharp entrepreneurs who are going to do some things in space, on the moon, or around the moon, or in orbit, and they're going to push the envelope on the rules. And U.S. District Court or other courts will be the ones that'll have to rely on resolving it. On the trade side, a trade agreement process preempts that because it runs ahead right now of where everybody is. It runs probably a decade ahead of getting all these countries lined up. And so the U.S. trade representative could do this and do it rather quickly. And it would bring a level of stability to this and answer a lot of these questions.
We've looked at we've glanced over the legal and the political aspects. The other part that we mentioned was the science. You're talking seriously about migration, about going to other planets or planetoids. What about the science? By more and more, we're realizing that space, no one can hear you scream as the radiation hits you. And, there are very serious, a solar flare during a moon flight or especially a Mars flight poses very severe challenges. I was almost thinking,
you just put your finger on NASA's future, because if NASA is not burdened with having to do the things like building space Artemis or space stations that run big budget for them over long periods of time, if they're relieved of that and they do what they do best and the JPL does best and they do exploration, you move them into on the science side to be those harbingers of things that are out there. They're out front of everyone. They're sort of the scouts, the pathfinders. Everyone else here is looking at trying to make money and basically get employment and pay your taxes, et cetera. But they should be out there warning us. What they recently did with the asteroid, fabulous. That's a great mission. But you can't do both. You can't lead the world off planet and build infrastructure and maintain it on the taxpayers' money, and at the same time do all these other things. Let's reallocate their money to do all those other things, and they would have a huge budget, and let the private sector basically take the responsibility for the former.
Yeah. And Steve, you may want to augment that with some of the speakers we had, like the researcher from Baylor, at our space symposium. But to build on what Bob is saying, first of all, these are very serious issues, both the unknowns regarding impact on our whole ocular eye system to obviously radiation and so forth. But there is a tremendous amount of research going on in the universities and so forth. But to Bob's point, it really needs much more, I think, intense coordination than we're seeing. Steve, to remind you, the researcher from Baylor referenced that we are dealing with very small sample data. There's only been a few hundred folks that went up to space for any extended period of time. And it's very hard to extrapolate what the real fundamental issues are, let alone what potential solution paths there might be. So I will say this, that the entrepreneurs that I've talked to, some of whom were at our recent space symposium, who are looking at space habitats and stations, are looking at some very, very clever proprietary ways to at least mitigate some of these issues. But again, to Bob's point, if NASA, for example, could focus on these different issues in a very focused way, I think a lot of them could, if not be resolved, could be successfully addressed as we proceed. And there's also the use of robots and how robots interact with humans and all that, and still have yet to be addressed. Steve, you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, when these kinds of issues are kind of in the same category of space debris mitigation. You have to deal with what are the real impacts of living and working in space on the human body, and how do you mitigate that? NASA has a budget for something called the human space research. They spent about, out of their whatever it is right now, $35 billion, they spend about $140 million on
Steve,
this.
they wish they had 30 or 35. The request is about 26 billion.
26, I'm sorry, yeah. They wish. So we're
Just inflation.
but I do know that they spend less than $140 million, and then actually on these these human factors. They have a list of literally hundreds and hundreds of experiments that they would like to do so that they can better understand how humans are going to respond living, whether it's in the microgravity environment that has a lot of impact on them, dealing with radiation on different levels, to what extent radiation is impact, and how do you mitigate that? Not to mention what's going on inside the body, in your microbiome. We had one of our speakers talked about the microbiome in our guts and the effects that microgravity is having on that. So there are just so many questions and that have to be answered. And part of what we would do with this working group is of course recommending real allocations to really resolve these issues in a more accelerated pace. Right now, they're kind of ambling along with what the budget that they have, and I think we need to really accelerate that process.
Well, the clock's running out on us now, in every sense, as we know. The doomsday clock,
Yeah.
but the doomsday clock for the Foreign Press Association is knolling away in the background. I'd like to thank you all. This is Ian Williams, President of the Foreign Press Association, and I think we've explored some very serious issues on what's been the issues that are coming up, anticipating that the Beyond Earth Institute is recommending that Congress look at as well. For Congress to anticipate rather than react is always a good idea. It doesn't always happen. But I'd like to thank Beyond Earth Institute, Steve, Courtney and Robert, for us stimulating an interesting discussion. I just had a dystopian nightmare of a Panamanian flag spaceship crewed by Somalis going through a radiation storm. It's we're extending maritime. I can't help it as a science fiction dystopian fan. All these things keep me, well, they don't keep me awake, but I wake up in the night thinking of them sometimes. I go back to sleep afterwards though. But thank you very much, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you at the next Foreign Press Association briefing. And please follow the Beyond Earth Institute and see what's happening beyond the horizon, as it were. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks again, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.